Since the dawn of ancient Greeks over 2 millennia ago, Europe has had an intimate relationship with war and violence. Europe's green fields have been soaked in the blood of men and women for centuries in the name of the myriad of rulers who carve up the continent and divide the people using propaganda to disguise their own agendas. It has only been since the fall of the Third Reich and the Nazi regime in Central Europe in 1945, and subsequently the establishment of the European Union, that we have seen a period of relative peace in Europe. This peace even has a name, called the Pax Europaea. The EU won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 for its role in maintaining peace on the historically troubled continent. In recent years, the EU has been under assault. Great Britain's vote to leave the EU, horrific terrorist attacks in France, thousands of refugees at the border running from destitution looking to prosper in Europe, internal currency issues and the financial crisis in Greece shaking the foundations of the common market. More worryingly, Putin's and Moscow's increasingly hostile foreign policy towards EU members, the annexation of Crimea, the Salisbury poisonings, the cyber attacks on the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in the Netherlands, and lastly, a constant campaign to undermine democracy within the EU. Critics of the EU say this is all evidence to suggest that the EU is impotent and crippled to the point of abolishment. But I vehemently disagree. All of the evidence suggests that we need a greater unity, closer political cohesion, and a fully realised federal government to shepherd Europe into the future. The EU has taken the model and idea of federal government from the USA but not seen it through to completion, which has done nothing but to create a bureaucratic mess and ineffectual incumbent state. Imagine, if you will, a United States where each state governor had veto power to block any decision from Congress or the President. An America where the governor of the smallest state could dismantle nationwide immigration reform or national banking reform. Imagine a United States conceived as an asymmetric federation in which states could opt out of the FBI, Border Control, Coast Guard or the US dollar, in which these states could say, we claim our right to join any of these federal institutions later, but for the moment we will simply observe and see how the rest of you cope. The international community would think the USA had lost the plot. It would be ridiculous to try and run a country, let alone an entire continent, that way, but this is the situation we find in the EU. One real-life example of how this lack of unification affects us negatively. As it is, we have 28 separate national intelligence services, each on their own battle against organised crime and terrorism. This is an extremely complex and difficult task, and hostile forces slip through the net. Paris, 2015, Madrid, 2004, London, 2005, Brussels, 2014. In all these situations, the terrorists involved had been known to at least one of the national intelligence agencies, but due to lack of cohesion and unity, information between intelligence services is erratic and unreliable. The best way to increase the effectiveness of all our intelligence and security services is to have a federal European security, an intelligence agency supported by a federal European government. There is a delusion in Europe. The once great nation-states and empires of the 19th century Europe are now small fish in the modern world. They are being outclassed by competitors such as the USA, China and Russia. Our largest neighbour, the Russian Federation, and its autocratic leader Vladimir Putin, is the greatest threat to European democracy and unity. Putin confirms this all the time through hostile acts and its efforts to undermine European democracy, only to be met with toothless responses. First and foremost, it is worth noting that Putin paints the Russian Federation as democratic, but this is far from reality. The state of affairs is constantly brought to light with Putin, through the Kremlin, attacking journalists, political opponents, and anyone who criticizes the Putin government. Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya was murdered in 2006 by an organization allegedly close to the Kremlin for criticizing Putin. In 2008, Putin further tightened his grip on Russia by becoming Prime Minister under puppet Dmitry Medvedev, only to succeed him again in 2012, where he has remained president for the past 6 years. There are few opposition parties in Russia, most of these allowed to continue as marionettes to thinly veil the underlying autocratic nature of Putin's government. Paul Klebnikov, Anastasia Barbova, Sergei Yushnikov, Boris Nemtsov, Sergei Magnitsky, Stanislav Marlarkov, and Natalia Estemirova are all names of Russian journalists, activists, lawyers, and political opponents who have been vocal about their criticisms of Putin and in turn have met an untimely demise. Democracy, for the time being, is dead in Russia. More worrisome, Putin doesn't seem content with keeping his hostile actions internal. Over recent years, Russia has turned towards Europe to exert its influence with clandestine motives. In the UK, the assassination of former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 and the attempted assassination of former Russian intelligence officer Sergei Skripal in 2018. Then, weeks later in 2018, a Russian cyber attack by the Russian intelligence agency GRU on the OPCW, Organisation for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the UK Foreign Office was prevented by Dutch intelligence services. Then we have the invasion of Georgia in 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, both hostile, illegal military actions by Putin to reclaim areas that had previously been in control by the former USSR. These moves threaten to undermine the European Union and European democracy. Former Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe, which have since founded independent sovereign nations, are quite rightly worried that Putin's intent is to reoccupy former Soviet land. What has the European response been to these attacks? They have remained verbal, and Putin is well aware that Europe would take no action and that it is in fact toothless. It's not until the US intervenes and tightens sanctions of Russia backed by its military clout does Putin back down. Not until then, Secretary of State John Kerry flew to the Baltic states to reassure them that they would be covered by the American military did Eastern European countries feel safe. Europe has become nothing more than a troublemaker for the US, more likely to get in the way than make any meaningful contribution. Furthermore, Putin backs fascist and far-right political groups in Europe. For example, Marine Le Pen of France's National Front has received €9.4 million in funding direct from banks in Moscow, which are purportedly to be part of a larger packet of €40 million from Putin's government. He is praised by xenophobic and divisive politicians such as Nick Griffin, Geert Wilders, Nigel Farage and Donald Trump. He has close ties to Jobbik in Hungary, the People's Party in Slovenia, and it is easy to understand why Putin is stoking the anti-European and isolationist voices. He is the product of the former Soviet Union, and it is better to have a weak, divided Europe than a strong, prosperous, unified one. We must understand that in the process, Putin is also undermining the foundations of our free and open society, and finds it all too easy to make use of our political weaknesses. The Kremlin has discovered, as Luke Harding put it in The Guardian, weak, permeable, and susceptible to foreign cash. Putin best illustrates how countries like France and Great Britain think themselves to be great instead of the powerless small nation-states that they are. Putin knows this and exploits it. The European Union's founders saw this. He who wants to win a place in the modern world must begin by creating unity. We are no longer competing with 19th century nation-states, rather we must face up to the great continental powers. Unity, as the founders knew, assumes a single political community and a single defence. Only by devising these can the dwarf of Europe once again play a meaningful role on the world stage. Foreign affairs and hostile rivals aren't the only reason for a European federal state. Due to the lack of cohesion and unity, European markets and industries suffer. The industrial base that has formed the backbone of the European employment for close to 200 years is deteriorating. The number of jobs in the European industry has fallen by more than 20% in the last 15 years. Meanwhile, employment in Asian and Latin American industrial sectors has grown rapidly and has remained stable in the USA. Less than the half of the top exporting countries in the world today are European, and it remains to be seen whether the continent can maintain these levels with ever-increasing labour, energy and transport costs. On average, production costs are a full percentage point higher than they are in the US, invariably because labour, electricity and fuel are more expensive in Europe. European industrial productivity is losing ground year after year. From 2004 to 2011, Europe lost 10% of its market share. Compared to the US average, production costs rose by 6% for Belgium, 7% for Sweden, 9% for France, and 10% for Italy. At the start of the 21st century, Europe accounted for 33% of global production and part of the global economic and industrial triangle that consisted of USA, Europe, Japan, By 2050, that economic triangle is to be USA, China and Japan, and will account for 45% of global production. In 2015, European production had dropped to 18% of global production. The three biggest players in the EU, Germany, Great Britain and France, each account for 3.2%, 3% and 2.4% respectively of global production. As individual nations, we can no longer compete with these huge continental powers unless the EU realises itself and becomes a unified continental power. Over recent years, production of automobiles has fallen from 16 million to 12 million per year. This trend is visible across the majority of manufacturing sectors. The shipbuilding industry has disappeared, the textile sector is dying, and energy production is significantly reliant on Russian imports, which they can weaponise if they see fit. Europe imports 90% of the oil and gas it needs. 41% of that comes from Russia. Today, as it stands, each individual nation from the EU negotiates its terms with the Russian state-owned Gazprom, which sets the prices. There was an attempt called the Orange Revolution, which was in response to Russia weaponizing its energy exports in 2004 to create European energy community so that member states of the EU could combine their negotiating power and barter with Russia as one. But this ultimately broke down because individual nations didn't want to give up a little bit of power to bolster the EU's strength. Again, in 2009 and 2014, energy supplies faltered due to Putin interfering with elections and due process in Ukraine, and yet we still lack the collective will and power to do anything about it. Additionally, the European Union wastes many megawatt hours due to a lack of a continental energy grid and lack of connections between member states. Excess energy produced by the solar plants in Spain or wind farms in the UK just goes to waste. It's not just energy costs and an over-reliance on Russian imports that stifle European economic competitiveness. Lack of a common policy on rail, road, air and digital markets impedes European competitiveness. Traffic regulations and speed limits are not harmonised across the Union, as well as licences for heavy good vehicles. Europe has no fewer than 31 different codes and systems in existence for the management of European airspace, with 38 air traffic controllers operating across 63 control towers. Meanwhile, in the USA, whose airspace is larger than that of Europe, has a single system operated by a single air traffic controller across 28 towers. It is estimated that a truly unified European airspace would save $3 billion in administrative costs and a further $6 billion in operating costs. European trains passing through more than one country require more than one electrification system, and not even the track gauges are identical across the Union. A train travelling from Madrid to Vilnius would have to change gauge. Spain uses the Iberian gauge, the Baltic states use the Russian gauge, and everything in between uses the European gauge. A train travelling from Paris to Amsterdam via Brussels requires a train that works at 3 different voltages and must be able to adapt to 4 different signalling systems. Europe is also losing gigantically when it comes to digital markets. Millions of people use Spotify. The company, originally established in Stockholm, Sweden, but relocated their business headquarters to the United States, where it was much easier to negotiate deals with major record labels and get access to 300 million people in a single market. The US offered something that the EU currently can't, a single legal framework when it came to copyright and digital distribution. In Europe, Spotify was constrained by national borders. There is no single European digital marketplace. There are 28 different legal frameworks and 28 different sets of legalization in regards to copyright. So in 2006, Spotify uprooted to the USA and took all the potential tax revenue with it. Now, this is a very brief introduction as to why the EU should form a more perfect union, fully integrated and cohesive. The EU has taken some blows over the years, but I strongly believe the only way forward into a prosperous future is as a united continent, under a strong European federal government, backed by a strong European economy. A federal Europe is the only viable option, it is the only logical option, and I strongly suspect it is the inevitable outcome. Isolationists and nationalists will fight it all along the way, but the only way we can secure our future is through a unified Europe.